The tech giants demonstrate their power in obliterating any online presence for Donald Trump and taking down the independent Parler platform. In the UK, Conservatives threaten Boris Johnson's leadership unless he maps out the terms on which lockdown will be ended, and America looks nervously ahead to an inauguration where multiple protests and violence are reportedly imminent. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. This week we've seen a remarkable moment in the power of the tech platforms. From President Trump being thrown off Twitter permanently, along with just about anyone else who's talked about QAnon, to Twitter alternative Parler being thrown off the Apple and Google app stores, swiftly followed by being shut down altogether by Amazon withdrawing its hosting services. This is something that's been coming for a while. Following the violence in Charlottesville back in August 2017, the chief executive of the internet service provider Cloudflare, Matthew Prince, said this: "Literally, I woke up in a bad mood and decided someone shouldn't be allowed on the internet." It was the Daily Stormer that was the far-right website that was thrown off their servers in that case. Having done so, he admitted that it was a bad precedent. He said this: "We need to have a discussion around this with clear rules and clear frameworks. My whims and those of Jeff Bezos and Larry Page and Mark Zuckerberg shouldn't be what determines what should be online." He didn't draw a distinction, but there was an important distinction between him and Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey of Twitter. They run an active platform. If they decide you can't have an account on Facebook or on Twitter, it's the equivalent of a bus company saying you can't ride on their buses. You could still use someone else's buses, or maybe even set up your own bus company. But Cloudflare and Amazon Web Services are infrastructure providers. Getting banned from them is the equivalent of being banned from using the roads. This isn't just for tech giants flexing their muscles, but it's a moment when significant parts of corporate America also became partisan activists. Banks such as Deutsche Bank, that provided services to Trump, have said that they will no longer do so. A number of companies, including Blue Cross, JP Morgan, Marriott, Citigroup, Commerce Bank, Dow, AT&T, Morgan Stanley, they've all cut off donations to Republicans who objected in any way to this year's election results. Citibank said it had done so on the grounds we will not support candidates who do not respect the rule of law. And that's a remarkable thing. The decision not to vote to confirm Joe Biden may well have been foolish, may well have been bad strategy, even disreputable, but it wasn't illegal. It was entirely within the rules. PayPal suspended the account of a group that paid for Trump supporters to travel to Washington last week. There's no evidence they took part in anything illegal while they were there. The vast majority of attendees didn't. Doesn't matter apparently. Stripe cut its services to Donald Trump's campaign. Oh, and because farce is never far behind, Macaulay Culkin has said that he supports the idea that Trump should be digitally edited out of Home Alone 2. A whole new level of what it means to be cancelled. So here's the problem. The basic infrastructure of the internet, the roads that all the data and online payments and all the rest runs on, it's a public good. Like the provision of electricity or gas to your house, like the water that comes through your taps. But it's owned by private corporations. And now those corporations have shown that they are willing to behave in a partisan way to deny people access to that public good. It would be like in the UK if British Gas decided to refuse providing heating to the offices of UKIP, where content is considered to be genuinely harmful because there is a line. It's when it becomes incentive to violence. When that happens, there should be a legal process managed according to established rules and with political independence. In 2017, Justice Anthony Kennedy likened internet platforms to the modern public square, stating that it was therefore unconstitutional to prevent sex offenders from accessing social network platforms. And this was also held to mean that the President of the United States couldn't block Twitter users from seeing his tweets because they're an essential part of public discourse. So how do we go from that to this? The president can't block people from seeing his tweets, but Twitter can block him from tweeting at all. Sex offenders have a constitutional right to be on Twitter, but Donald Trump does not. If there's some legal principle at work there that could be enforced and interpreted consistently, it's pretty hard to see it. Black Lives Matter protesters were permitted without hindrance in expressing support for riots. Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times said, "Destroying property which can be replaced is not violence." No problem from Twitter. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris used Twitter to encourage donations for posting bail for people charged with rioting. No problems from Twitter. 6 months after Trump's election in 2016, Nancy Pelosi tweeted, "Our election was hijacked. There was no question. Congress has a duty to hashtag protect our democracy and hashtag follow the facts." No problems with Twitter. On the other side, the New York Post stories about Hunter Biden were shut down by Twitter and Facebook almost straight away. The tech giants argue that they are platforms, not publishers, therefore they're not responsible for harm caused by what people post, but when it suits them, then they're a publisher and they will kick you off, remove your content and shut you down with no appeal. Parler was supposed to be part of the answer. Okay, so if you won't let us post content on Twitter, we'll do what you suggest. We'll set up an alternative. Whether there was actual monopolistic behaviour, i.e. cartel-like coordination between Google, Apple and Amazon, is hard to prove. But the outcome was certainly monopolistic force as they shut it down. Parler is now suing Amazon, alleging antitrust, breach of contract and something called tortious interference. Unfortunately, it has zero chance of success. The essence of their case is this. 1, it's not fair. Amazon holds Parler to higher standards than Twitter. Whether that's true or not, it's legally irrelevant. 2, that Amazon is motivated by political animus. Political animus is not a thing. Amazon can choose who it takes on as a client for whatever reason they like. 3, that it's antitrust, because Amazon has a financial interest in benefiting Twitter by destroying its competitor. But that doesn't make sense, because both Twitter and Parler were Amazon customers, so benefiting one at the expense of the other gives no particular financial benefit to Amazon. 4, that there was a breach of contract, because the contract gives them a right to 30 days notice of termination. And also, that's not true, because there's a get-out clause which can be clearly shown to apply in this case. You shouldn't be surprised that the fine print of your contract with companies like Amazon is that they can do what they want when it suits them. So this isn't a legal question. It is a much bigger, more profound question than that. And half of America thinks that all of this is just fine and dandy. Generally, this is an issue people only care about if it's being used against their own side. They don't object when it's the other lot that gets booted. The leaders of other nations see it. Some, like Angela Merkel of Germany, express their concern at the move to permanently remove Trump from the internet. And the tech companies, partisan though they may be, they do understand the dangerous place they've taken us to. The chief executive of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, acknowledged that this is an untenable position. He said this: "Yes, we all need to look critically at inconsistencies of our policy and enforcement. Yes, we need to look at how our service might incentivize distraction and harm. Yes, we need more transparency in our moderation operations. All this can't erode a free and open global internet," which sounds a lot like what the chief executive of Cloudflare said. Acknowledging the danger of your own power isn't actually a solution to power being in the wrong hands and being able to be used without accountability. Democrats will feel relaxed about this because their side won, but it will be on them if they don't address this issue in the period when they have control of the legislative process. Now, in a minute, we'll look at some of the week's other news. But first, on this channel, I often ask straightforward, neutral questions and look to the evidence without preconceptions as to what I will find. Surely we've now seen enough that we should be able to do the same for one very simple question. Do lockdowns work? There's lots of people arguing that it does, presenting their evidence. There's lots of people arguing that it doesn't, presenting their evidence. What happens when you evaluate the evidence without anything to prove whatsoever? Well, we'll find out what happens when I give it a try in my next video on Monday next week, being launched at 7 p.m. UK time. Do lockdowns work? Let's see. We'll see you then. COVID-19 infection rates have started to fall across England for all age groups, although that hasn't yet fed through to hospital admissions, which are at record levels in all regions save for London and the South East, with the numbers of ICU patients going up in all regions. It'll take a while for the decline in infection rates to feed through to hospital occupancy. It's expected to get worse in the next couple of weeks before it gets better, which is going to be a real area of focus, given the extreme stress that the understaffed health service is demonstrating now. It's something everyone is enduring in the hope and belief that this is going to go away as soon as the vaccine is finally rolled out through the most vulnerable population. Because people are at the end of their tether. Health workers are exhausted, the population is finding lockdown harder to stick to, businesses are collapsing in ever greater numbers, and yet government figures continue to suggest that all these measures could go on and on. Government scientist Jonathan Van Tam said that lockdown measures could be in place until late spring. Imperial's Neil Ferguson, Professor Lockdown, lived up to his name by saying "hold my beer" and suggesting there should be restrictions still in place up to the autumn. That led one of the leaders of the lockdown sceptic Conservative MPs, Steve Baker, to issue a call for a freedom plan, an explicit statement about what level of vaccination will trigger the relaxation of restrictions. And if this isn't forthcoming, he threatens that the debate will begin to focus on Boris Johnson's leadership of the party. This comes as some are predicting that there will be a big push for a zero COVID approach, a debate that would be even more divisive and difficult than the one that there was right at the start of the pandemic. And hey, did someone mention divisiveness? Well, America continues to nervously prepare for the inauguration of Joe Biden as president next week. In the meantime, President Trump released a video making as clear and unambiguous a call to his supporters to avoid violence as you could hope for. Many would argue it would have been more useful a couple of weeks ago, but it seems likely to have been prompted by intelligence about the plans of various groups who are intending to protest in his name. Hardcore Trump supporters planning to protest at each of the state capitals over this weekend and then at the inauguration itself, according to the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a think tank that tracks online extremism. Trump's calls for no violence made little impact on those organising for these events. Apparently, one thing they've noted is that Trump has still not conceded defeat to Biden, which they've taken as giving tacit approval to their plans to wage war against the political establishment. Some now think that the inauguration will be the moment when Trump emerges, overseeing the arrest of all the paedophiles and blah, blah, blah. It's a reminder that people who are deeply into a belief are capable of analysing every word that someone says and will find some interpretation that reinforces exactly what they wanted to believe. In the meantime, of course, Trump has been impeached again, a process that is largely symbolic unless sufficient Republicans can be enticed into supporting it when it finally gets to the Senate, by which time he will no longer be president. The only equation that matters is how many Republicans would like to guarantee that Trump can't be the candidate for their party in 2024 who are prepared to run the risk of becoming a target for the most extreme of his supporters. The answer to that question might be answered by what happens in the coming week, since the amount of violence that's seen in practice may influence their perception of the level of threat. There is at least one area where Republicans and Democrats are agreed. According to a new poll from Axios Ipsos, 83% of Republicans and 78% of Democrats agree that America is falling apart. You'd hope that people would hear that message and begin to reflect on what they need to do to deliver the necessary healing that everyone's talking about. Well, in other news, CNN's Don Lemon told 74 million Americans who voted for Trump that they had sided with the Ku Klux Klan and Nazis, so that should do wonders for the healing. The anchor was invited to agree that there was a difference between those who voted Trump and the people who invaded the Capitol building, and that, it seems, is something he couldn't bring himself to do. In the meantime, there have been other signs of the death throes of the Trump presidency, specifically in relation to climate science. The Trump appointees to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, David Legates and Ryan Maue, were involved in the production of a number of climate briefs, which were distributed this week on several non-government websites, looking kind of like they've been laid out on Microsoft Word or something, but nevertheless carrying the seal of the Office of the President of the United States. The briefs, written by well-known figures in the climate sceptic movement, such as William Happer, the Connollys and Willie Soon and John Christie, were apparently not authorised to carry the presidential seal. Potentially a crime. Christina Baum, the communications director for the OSTP, said this: "These papers were not created at the direction of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, nor were they cleared or approved by OSTP leadership." The director of the OSTP, Kelvin Drudgemeyer, promptly fired the culprits. Now, whatever you think about the arguments on the issue, this was a pretty bizarre exercise, possibly an attempt to get something onto the official government website just before Trump left the White House, in the spirit of a great big raspberry to the climate science community. It's the sort of thing you associate with graduates with a grudge, rather than a government scientific institution. In the meantime, the client scientific community on Twitter was distracted by another outburst, as high-profile scientist Michael Mann published a new book talking about the new climate wars. Alongside various people tweeting congratulations to him was a series of significantly less happy contributions from figures associated with the Breakthrough Institute. Zeke Housefather, for instance, tweeted this: "Michael Mann has a new book out, The New Climate War. I've co-authored papers in the past with Mike and respect his scientific and communications work. However, in his book, he claims that my organisation, the Breakthrough Institute, was initially linked to the fossil fuel industry. This is false." It seems that Mann had gone after the Institute, claiming it was founded with and funded by fossil fuel money. Seems he's not a fan of the Institute's advocacy of nuclear power, amongst other things. This was apparently in spite of the Institute having sent him a letter months ago pointing out that this was not the case, which they've now published on their website. He proudly restated his claims on Twitter, including posting this page, saying, as of 2005, they proudly acknowledged as one of their funders the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. Unfortunately, Zeke Housefather pointed out the page he tweeted was not from 2005 at all, but from 2014, showing the claim that the organisation was started with fossil fuel money to be wholly unsupported. Now, I highlight this because it's an indicator there's quite a bit going on in the climate science community, which is to do with activism, not science. It's the latest chapter that has seen complaints about how the use by some climate science advocates of the term climate denier has gradually become extended to apply to anyone who disagrees with certain policy prescriptions. I haven't seen Mann's new book yet, but it sounds as though it may be taking us to new places in that vein. So expect more on this in due course. Now, in a minute, we'll answer a couple of comments and go to the final thought for the week. But first, how about something positive? On Wednesday next week, we'll all be looking forward to seeing whether Joe Biden's inauguration leads to the apocalypse of civil war with various groups promising trouble, or whether it will in fact be the moment when Trump triumphantly reveals the prosecution of the underground pedophile ring. Spoiler, no, he won't. So, as some sort of antidote as the hours tick away to the big moment, how about something a bit more optimistic to remind you of the long-term amazing progress we've made and will hopefully continue to make as a human society? How we fed the world. From the predictions of Malthus through to the modern-day gloom of Paul Ehrlich, people have been arguing that we were on the brink of starvation as population expanded for centuries. But it didn't happen. Not because it couldn't have happened. And the story about how we actually fed the world and why we have a good chance of continuing to do so is a story worth telling. And that's the story I'll be telling on the video to be launched on Wednesday next week at 7 p.m. UK time, well in advance of the big event, so that you have something positive to see you through whatever form of bright new hope or dark Armageddon you expect lies ahead. See you then. Okay, first a comment on How Did America Get Polarised, the video that I launched on Monday this week. In a video that criticises political polarisation, I find it slightly ironic that literally every single one of your polarisation examples hold only the right guilty and never the left. especially when we have a left wing that argues that all science is a social construct created by the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Well, that isn't quite right. It suggests that it was a video about, we're polarised, and then selected some random examples which could have been taken from one side or the other. Now, you could make that video, and there would be plenty of examples on both sides. But this video was about the history of how US politics became distinctively polarised. And the issues that have defined that polarisation over the last 50 years have been the ones that I covered. And I didn't talk in the language of left-right blame. I highlighted the key transformative moments that changed non-partisan issues into partisan ones. From Nixon's shift to adopt abortion as a partisan issue, through to Malcolm X's initial holding up of gun ownership via the Second Amendment, that well-known right-winger Malcolm X, and then the backlash and response that led to it being taken up by the NRA and finally framed in a rereading of the Second Amendment. Those are all pivotal moments in the transformation of non-partisan issues into partisan ones. Now, I've spoken before on this channel about the craziness that has developed on the extreme left of identity politics, and will no doubt do so again in the future. But it is arguably a different phenomenon to the very specific question I was asking. It's about the evolution of a political philosophy and moving from representing the workers, which used to be what the left was defined by, to playing to identity groups. It would make an interesting video in its own right, and that video might well get made. By the way, for me, providing a non-partisan approach means looking at evidence and relating it as I find it, not providing within a single video some artificial exact balance to ensure that, everyone's annoyed equally. But just to balance things up in this section, let's have a brick back from the other direction. This comment came in just today on an older video, the truth about the Californian wildfires video. I conclude that this post is a climate change denial post, in as much as it compares data to past weather and scarcely mentions climate change. The sad fact is the entire western US is drying out, and we recently had a severe drought that killed off many trees. This is not just a fluctuation of weather. The CO2 has caused the weather worldwide to change already, and it will continue. It was a while ago, so you may not recall, but that video looked at the scientific literature and what scientists were additionally saying about the California wildfires. And in that specific instance, there was lots of historical context, and there were circumstances that were relevant to the analysis, and the potential influence of climate change wasn't insignificant, but it wasn't the major factor. Not good enough for this commenter, for whom only a major focus on climate change is sufficient to move it out of the realms of a denier video. In a subsequent reply to my reply, he suggested that the video was unbalanced because it didn't spend enough time dwelling on the climate change component. This is what happens when follow the science becomes a political slogan, not an actual instruction. In these videos, I frame as neutral a question as possible and look at the evidence. They're not campaign videos. So they'll only line up with your campaign message if the evidence does. I do lots of videos about the broader issues around climate change, but if it wasn't a major factor in some extreme event, or if polar bears are not currently showing decline, or whatever it is, then that's what I will report. If your campaign can't be supported by the truth, then shame on your campaign. Find a way to campaign better that draws on what the science says, not what you think it should say. You might well have been distracted by other news, but this week saw something pretty chilling and remarkable. Academics in Russia are now being told that they need the government's permission to hold lectures or give talks, including online. The legislation put forward by Putin's government is clamping down on educational activities that take place outside of authorised establishments to prevent anti-Russian forces who might be spreading the sort of education that, could undermine trust in Putin's policies, for instance. The law covers any dissemination of knowledge, abilities, skills, values, experience, and competencies for the purpose of intellectual, moral, creative, physical, and professional development. And it applies anywhere. Lectures in libraries, museums, podcasts, online video, covering any topic. A petition signed by 500 academics who presumably were under the impression that, even if they live in a kleptocracy, it's no longer meant to be a full-blown authoritarian dictatorship. They said this is an attempt by the state to take control of the freedom to spread knowledge. The expectation is that it will be used to crack down on those who teach things irritating to authorities. For instance, criticisms on the role of the Soviet Union in the Second World War. Now, it sounds pretty horrific, and it is. Luckily for most of us, we don't live under a state that would do that. At least, so long as you don't ask the former master at Eton, Will Noland, who was sacked for refusing to take down a video lecture he'd posted on YouTube. He appealed his case and lost it. As I said at the time, the head teacher was within his rights to make the demand, but it doesn't get away from the fact that the educational institutions of the country are increasingly cracking down on what is and what is not allowed to be taught. The orthodoxy they're imposing isn't one that's demanded by the government. In some ways, it's kind of hostile to the government that we currently have. But it's still an orthodoxy where certain facts are not allowed to be mentioned and certain arguments are held to be self-evidently proof of your inferior moral character, sufficient to ostracize you from society to a degree where you may never work in education again. That's not idle rhetoric, by the way. The head teacher's reportedly threatening to refer Noland to the Teaching Regulation Agency, which would have the power to ban him from teaching for life. Right now, his online tutoring business is thriving as a result of the controversy. So that's all right, because obviously we'll never get to the point where the tech companies would remove videos for expressing content they disagree with. Oh, wait. In an article in The Spectator, Noland quoted Victor Klemperer saying that words are like tiny doses of arsenic, swallowed unnoticed, and then after a while the toxic reaction sets in. The language of inclusion, tolerance, lived experience, and following the science are all benign concepts in theory until you look to see how they're being enforced in practice. Now, we're not in Russia's position. They've swallowed more arsenic than us, but we live in a society where large numbers of people are scared to say what they think because of the likely consequences. We can take that as a warning sign or we can ignore it. At least I think we still have a choice. Speaking of choices, since it seems that even mainstream channels can't guarantee surviving YouTube purges, should the urge take them, I've set up a mirror for this channel on Odyssey. See, there's a link in the show notes. Should any videos be removed in the future for whatever reason, at least there'll still be a place that people will be able to go to see that. I've also started uploading to Rumble. Rumble's a bit clunky right now, but it seems to be worthwhile not being dependent on one place. All this is why I'm grateful, of course, for the good people who support this channel on Patreon. It enables me to keep producing content on the issues that matter, regardless of whether they convey messages that YouTube will agree with or not, or indeed whether their advertisers will support. It enables me to put in the time it takes to produce 3 videos or more per week, even though a number of them require quite a bit of time and research. So, if you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please consider signing up at patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week full of historical world events, but hopefully not cataclysmic ones. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.